Hey guys, in this video I'm going to be tackling this 1/35 scale Lanza from scale 75. I'm James and you're watching LPJ Models. Now this figure is a 3D print that has been cleaned up and cast in resin. The details on this figure are exquisite, they're crisp and defined, and the sculpt is also nice and natural. He looks nice and relaxed and he's full of character. There are loads of small details on this figure that make it stand out. The Panzerfaust slung over the shoulder, the wristwatch, the rifle at his side, and a really well realised and sculpted face. Right, let's stick this figure together before we move on to paint. The glue I used to assemble this figure is VMS Flexi 5K Black Extra Thin Super Glue. It's one of my favourite CAs and it's also pretty resilient. And to make painting easier, I'm going to leave off and eventually lose the helmet. First up on this figure, we're going to prime it and lay down some base colours before moving on to detail work. The figure was primed in its entirety with MRP Fine Surface Primer Black. This is a bit thinner than Mr. Surfacer and is my attempt to preserve surface detail. Once the primer was down and dry, I blocked in some of the base colours, starting with the uniform. For this I used Vallejo German uniform. We've all seen that notorious picture. There are loads of shades you can use for a German uniform. But to make it simple, I settled on the stock Vallejo one. This was blocked in with a slightly bigger brush than normal, making sure to get in all the nooks and crannies. I decided to block in the colours first because I wanted to try a different approach than what I usually did. Anyway, the flesh was based with Vallejo Cork Brown. A few light coats was enough to bring this up to a moderate opacity. The weapons pouches were painted with Vallejo Leather Brown. This might not be the final colour, but it's a base coat to work from. You can also see here the Panzerfaust was based with a light sand colour. With the base coating done, let's move on to the face. I'm not going to go into a crazy amount of detail here because it's really hard to film and paint a 1/35 scale face, but I'll give you the rundown. First up, I tackled the eyes. This was done by painting a horizontal slice across the eye with Vallejo Green Grey. The pupils were then blocked in with a vertical slice, and then the eyelids were closed off with the base flesh colour. To start to add some definition to the face, I applied a wash of Liquitex Raw Umber ink, highly diluted, before moving on to adding some highlights with Vallejo Light Flesh. I then followed this by adding some shading with Vallejo Hull Red and Dark Prussian Blue, just to give a little bit of depth to the features on the face. One of the main reasons I wanted to do this video is because I saw a fantasy figure painter use a cross-hatching method to add depth and texture to their shadows and highlights. So I wanted to give this a go, and the testbed was the uniform. It's always exciting to try out new techniques, so let's see how we get on. First up, I laid my colours out on my wet palette, starting with my mid-tone, Vallejo German uniform, my highlight tone was AK 3rd Gen Grey Green, and my main shadow tone was AK 3rd Gen Extra Dark Green. But this will be darkened further with some Vallejo Black, and some Vallejo Dark Prussian Blue. So these are the stock shades I'll be using, but we're going to need some graduations in between. So I mixed these shades together to make those mid-tones. The grey green and the German uniform and the very dark green, and then the black, blue and the very dark green for those extra deep shadows. So we've got about 6 shades from lightest to darkest. Let's start putting these on the figure. First up, I started with pure AK 3rd Gen Grey Green. This was hatched onto the highlights with short linear strokes I don't think the direction matters because it will eventually be blended down. And at the start of this process, I got to admit, it does look a bit rubbish. But I'm sure it will all come together. A high quality fine brush is essential for this work, so I'm using a selection of 20 Kolinsky sables. The bulk of the work was done with a Da Vinci Maestro 20 Kolinsky sable. My other sables were getting a bit tired, and this is a slightly cheaper option, but it still is a pretty fine brush. With each layer of hatching, you can see how the opacity increases and the highlights start to look brighter. And with more layers of these little crisscrosses, the paint job is starting to look a little bit tidier. For the most extreme highlights in this step, I used an almost pointillistic approach, using tiny dots to build up those extreme highlights. Next up, everything was blended together with an ultra thin, almost a filter, of Vallejo German uniform. I'm using this to tone down the texture and to make the transitions a little smoother. I found it harder to hatch the shadow colours for some reason, maybe because the contrast wasn't there and I couldn't see it very well, but the shadow colours were brushed into the creases and around details, graduating from medium dark to very dark in the extremities. In the end, my shadow tones weren't as deep as I'd wanted them to be, so I mixed up some Liquitex Raw Umber and Muted Grey acrylic inks. These were highly thinned and used as a shadow enhancer, just to add some extra depth to those dark sections. You don't have to use these Liquitex inks, but they are really good and I highly recommend you try them out. The depth and vibrancy of these inks is just unmatched, and I'll definitely be using more for figure painting in the future. Next up, it's time to repeat that whole process again, but on the trousers. And because we've got broader areas of fabric to work with, I think this illustrates the process a bit better. Again, the highlights were hatched and graduated from middle highlight to brightest highlights. A quick note, don't let the footage deceive you, there are several layers at play here, and as I say with all my figure painting videos, there's a lot of back and forth. So don't be afraid to go back and correct highlights or shadows as you see fit. On the trousers, it was much easier to hatch and graduate the shadows, as you can see here on this initial shadow sketch I'm doing. Next up was to blend those shadows and highlights together with a glaze, Vallejo German uniform again. This helps to tie things together and get rid of some of the harshness, while allowing some of that texture to show through. The next layer I did was a refinement of the highlights. AK 3rd Gen Grey Green was hatched on the extremities of the highlights, following the contours of the fabrics and the areas that would catch the light. For the final layer of highlights, this time I did a solid glaze of slightly diluted grey-green, just to bring those top highlights together. I then refined the shadows with the shadow mixes I showed at the start. This was the final step before bringing everything together with a glaze, again, of Vallejo German uniform. With the uniform done, let's move on to the details. I think painting the details can make or break a figure. So take a bit of extra care when painting these details in and the figure will spring to life. I started with the strapping. Some straps were picked out with tan and some straps were picked out with Vallejo black. These were slightly highlighted with a touch of pink. The pouches were painted with various shades of leather and tan. I used Vallejo German camouflage beige for the tan ones, and used those Liquitex inks to refine the shadows, before refining the highlights with more Vallejo German camouflage beige. I mixed in a tiny amount of white for the extreme highlights. For the belt buckle and the buttons, I used a non-metallic metal approach. The base colour for this was Vallejo White Grey, and for shading I mixed in some touches of black and dark Prussian blue. To add some variety, the boot gaiters were painted with Vallejo Russian uniform World War II. Because I used the same colours for both the tunic and the trousers, I thought it was a good idea to vary some of the colours on the rest of the figure, just to add some visual interest. To highlight the gaiters, I mixed in some of that grey-green from before, just a touch so as not to shift the colour too much. The boots were painted with Vallejo Leather Brown, mixed with a touch of Liquitex Raw Umber ink. I started off detailing the boots with some shadows using Vallejo German Sea Black Brown. These forced shadows will help to show some of the detail and add a bit more depth to the boots. They were then scuffed up with some Vallejo Brown Sand. I wanted these boots to look like a pair of well worn in old leather boots. May not be realistic, but it adds some visual interest to the figure. Vallejo Brown Sand was dabbed and dotted on areas I expect the boots to wear. To blend the effects together, the boots were given a glaze of Liquitex Raw Umber. Can you tell I've only got a couple of these inks yet? The boot laces were then picked out with German camouflage beige. The shovel holder was painted in black and then given some distressing with a pink grey colour. This was then given a glaze of Vallejo black. Next up was to tackle the rifle and the shovel handle, and these were wood, so it's oil paint time. I used a mix of raw umber and burnt umber and brushed this over the wooden areas. I used some VMS Oil Expert Enhancing Medium to slightly speed up the drying time. After about 10 minutes, when the thinner had evaporated, I brushed away some of the oil paint with a stiff old brush to give the impression of wood grain. If I got any in any wrong spots, this was just removed with some VMS Universal Weathering Carrier Light. The same treatment was given to the wood areas on the rifle. You can see that I knocked off the end of the barrel here. To make sure I didn't lose it, I used some liquid mask and basically glued it to the paint pot I was using as a paint stand. I lost the original helmet somewhere, so I had to print another one. I found one with netting on Cults 3D, printed this and applied it to the model. It was at this point I made a mistake. I needed to make a vignette for this figure, so I spent a few days and many hours making some bricks, smoothing some bricks, laying some bricks, making some antique wooden beams, and then gluing them in place, mortaring some bricks, wiping some bricks, making some cork slabs and gluing them in place, painting on some plaster, painting on some paint. And then I realised, while most things I was doing was to scale, the door was printed using measurements from an actual door, the bricks are 1/35 scale moulded bricks. The scale is right, but it kind of swamped the figure in a really bad way. If the figure was as tall as he is now, with the base, it would be fine. But that extra centimetre and a half, remove that and he just looks like a hobbit, and the whole vignette was completely out of balance. It was a nice idea, and I do need to make a vignette for this guy, but it just didn't look right. Which is a real shame because I had some real fun making it, but it just didn't sit right. And sometimes things don't go right, and that's fine. I mean, this is a hobby after all, but it was a tad annoying. And I thought I'd put it in because I put all the work in, And although I had to slam the brakes on with it, I still wanted to show you. And that concludes my 1/35th scale 75 Lanza video. I'd like to give a huge thanks to my patrons for supporting my work. And I'd like to thank you for watching. I'd also like to apologise for my stuffy voice. I've had bad colds and sinus issues for about 3 months now, and it's starting to grate. But hey ho. I hope you found this video useful and or entertaining. I'm James from LPJ Models. Thanks for watching.